Plundered, Episode 7. The Monuments Men and Women. As Allied forces moved across Europe, they encountered more than battlefields. They found shattered churches, burned libraries, damaged museums, abandoned archives, and hidden repositories containing thousands of artworks and cultural objects. A small international group of specialists was assigned an extraordinary responsibility: protect the cultural heritage that remained, investigate what had been taken, and help return recovered property to the countries and people from whom it had been removed. They became popularly known as the Monuments Men, but not all of them were men, and their real mission was far larger than searching for famous paintings. The official organization was the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, usually shortened to MFAA. It was established in 1943 within Allied civil affairs and military government structures. Its members included museum curators, architects, historians, artists, archaeologists, archivists, librarians, and conservators. Their mission included identifying monuments, museums, and archives at risk, advising military commanders, documenting damage, protecting collections, and tracing cultural property removed by Nazi forces. The program developed because the destruction of Europe's cultural heritage was already impossible to ignore. Modern warfare placed historic cities and monuments directly in the path of bombing, artillery, and ground combat. Churches could be used as observation posts. Museums could become military headquarters. Libraries could burn after nearby attacks. Cultural buildings could not be protected at the cost of soldiers' lives. Military necessity remained the priority, but unnecessary destruction could still be reduced. Maps and lists identifying important monuments were supplied to Allied commands. The Roberts Commission, created in the United States in 1943, helped prepare handbooks and information for the officers working in the field. The monuments officers did not command armies. They advised commanders. A single officer might be responsible for an enormous area containing hundreds of churches, museums, libraries, and historic buildings. Transport was often difficult. Vehicles, fuel, and drivers were needed for military operations first. An art historian might understand how to protect a damaged fresco but still have no truck available to reach it. Much of the work was practical and unglamorous. An officer might inspect a damaged church roof, arrange temporary covering before rain destroyed wall paintings, prevent soldiers from using a historic building as accommodation, protect an archive from looting, or place warning signs around a museum. These actions rarely produced dramatic photographs. They could determine whether an important building survived. The first major field operations took place in Italy. Italy contained an extraordinary concentration of historic buildings, churches, archaeological sites, and artworks. It was also an active battlefield. Monuments officers entered towns after the fighting and assessed what could still be saved. They worked with Italian museum staff, priests, architects, and local officials. The work demonstrated that cultural protection could not simply wait until the war ended. Damage became worse through fire, rain, structural collapse, and theft. Emergency preservation had to begin while military operations continued nearby. After the Normandy landings in June 1944, the mission expanded through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Officers inspected damaged cathedrals, town centers, and museums. They searched for evacuated collections and tried to restore local control over cultural sites. At first, their mission focused heavily on protection. But as Allied armies entered Germany, another responsibility became increasingly important: recovery. The officers began finding artworks, books, and archives inside castles, monasteries, warehouses, railway cars, private estates, and underground mines. Not everything found in Germany had been stolen. German museums had moved many of their own collections for protection from bombing. A repository could therefore contain several different categories of property. One painting might belong to a German public museum. Another might have been confiscated from a Jewish collector in Paris. Another might come from a church in occupied Poland. Another might form part of Hermann Göring's collection. The presence of several objects in one building did not mean that they shared the same history. Each object had to be investigated. Neuschwanstein Castle became one of the most important discoveries. It contained large quantities of cultural property processed through the Nazi ERR organization. It also contained documents and photographic records that helped investigators connect objects with collections confiscated in France. James Rorimer was among the officers who supervised work connected with the castle. He also worked with Rose Valland, whose secret records from the Jeu de Paume helped identify shipments and destinations. Altaussee salt mine became another famous repository. Thousands of artworks and cultural objects had been stored deep underground. Local mine workers had already acted to prevent explosives from destroying the chambers before Allied cultural officers began the recovery operation. Robert Posey, Lincoln Kirstein, and George Stout were among those connected with the Allied investigation and removal work. But they did not act alone. Military engineers reopened blocked passages. Soldiers provided security. Miners guided teams underground. Drivers and laborers moved crates. The recovery depended on a much larger operation than the small group shown in popular films. The monument's personnel also investigated collections belonging to senior Nazi officials. Large parts of Hermann Göring's collection were found around Berchtesgaden and processed at Unterstein before being transported to Allied collecting points. Finding the art was only the beginning. Every object needed to be secured, photographed, measured, assigned a recovery number, compared with German inventories and confiscation records. A painting might carry several numbers, one from its original owner, another from Göring's collection, another from the Allied recovery team. These marks could reconnect the object with its earlier history. If labels were removed or records separated from the artwork, vital evidence could be lost. The scale of the recovered property required secure processing centers. In 1945, the Americans established two principal central collecting points at Munich and Wiesbaden. Shipments of paintings, sculpture, books, manuscripts, furniture, and decorative objects arrived from repositories across Germany and Austria. Staff inventoried, photographed, researched, and sorted the material. The collecting points were part warehouse, part museum laboratory, and part investigation center. At Munich, large quantities of property connected with Altaussee, the Linz Project, and Nazi collections were processed. Wiesbaden handled German museum collections and foreign restitution material. Women played essential roles in this phase. Edith Standen, a textile specialist who served in the Women's Army Corps, worked extensively at the Wiesbaden collecting point. Ardelia Hall became an important American official in post-war restitution and records management. Juliana Bumbar also served within the post-war monuments and restitution structure. Rose Valland worked with collecting point personnel while tracing property removed from France. This is why the phrase monuments men and women gives a fuller picture. Women were often excluded from frontline military assignments, but post-war restitution depended heavily on research, cataloging, correspondence, and claims processing. Their work was not secondary. Without accurate records, recovered objects could not be returned properly. Books and archives created another enormous challenge. Millions of books, manuscripts, and religious materials had been taken from individuals, libraries, synagogues, schools, and cultural organizations. The Offenbach Archival Depot became a major center for processing this material. A painting could sometimes be recognized immediately. A book might look identical to thousands of others. Ownership could depend on a stamp, handwritten name, or bookplate inside the cover. A small mark could reconnect a book with a destroyed family or community. The program also faced difficult ethical questions after the war. In 1945, American authorities proposed sending German-owned paintings to the United States for temporary custody. Several MFAA officers opposed the plan. Their protest became known as the Wiesbaden Manifesto. They argued that removing a nation's cultural heritage as a prize of war would repeat the kind of conduct they had been sent to reverse. The monuments officers did not all survive. British officer Ronald Balfour was killed by shell fire in Germany in March 1945. American architect Walter Huchthausen was killed by German machine gun fire in April while traveling in connection with an art discovery. Their deaths show that cultural protection work took place within genuine military danger. The program achieved remarkable results. It also had serious limitations. There were too few officers. They lacked vehicles and staff. Some monuments had already been destroyed. Some objects disappeared before repositories were secured. Some military units ignored protective instructions, and recovery did not guarantee restitution. Allied policy generally returned objects first to the country from which they had been removed. That country then carried responsibility for returning them to the museum, family, or institution that had owned them. Many objects were successfully returned. Others remained unidentified or unresolved for decades. The monument's men and women did not repair every loss. They created the foundations for continued research. Their records remain essential today. Property cards, photographs, transport lists, and reports allow modern researchers to trace an object from a wartime repository to a collecting point and then toward restitution. Popular films have introduced millions of viewers to their story, but the true history was not a simple treasure hunt. It involved damaged buildings, wet archives, broken crates, missing vehicles, and years of paperwork. The most important achievement was not finding famous art. It was preserving evidence. The monument's men and women showed that cultural heritage could be treated as part of the responsibility of military victory. They could not undo Nazi plunder. They could protect what survived. They could document what they found. And they could begin the long process of returning cultural property to its lawful owners. In the next episode of Plundered, we follow one of the most famous restitution cases in modern history. Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I remained in an Austrian museum for decades. Its return required a legal fight led by Maria Altmann, a case that reached the United States Supreme Court and changed the international conversation about Nazi-looted art. This is Plundered, an investigation into Nazi looting and the search for justice.